without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Ron to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Sam. This is Ron Moser, and I'm very excited about this webinar today. The topic is Deploying to the Cloud, a case study on the development of ENAC's Cloud-Enabled Accreditation Program. We have some terrific panelists with us today. Scott Paddock is a security solutions architect at Amazon Web Services. His background is largely oriented around healthcare and related regulatory compliance. Prior to joining AWS, he worked in healthcare IT and governance for companies in the health exchange and medical clinical trial spaces. Scott holds an MS in information security from Brandeis University. He lives in Seattle but does not like coffee. Kurt Hagerman is Chief Information Security Officer at Armor. He's responsible for the governance, risk, and compliance side of the security mission for both corporate and customer-facing products. He regularly consults with Armor prospects and customers on PCI, HIPAA, and financial services regulations, and helps them understand how these regulations impact their business and how Armor can help them meet their regulatory responsibilities. Mr. Hagerman regularly speaks and writes on information security topics in the payments and healthcare spaces, as well as on cloud security. He holds CISA and CISSP certifications and is an active participant with local chapters of ISACA, CSA, and ISSA. Scott Schimpf is Vice President of Technology and Information Security Officer at Alpha 2. He has an almost 30-year career designing and developing software and hardware systems. At Alpha 2, he's responsible for designing and implementing the active-active cloud solution for their hosted software as a service products and all internal systems. As Information Security Officer, he's responsible for developing and maintaining all security, technical processes, and procedures at Alpha 2. My name is Ron Moser. I'm Managing Director of Moser House Consulting, LLC, a healthcare IT consulting company. I'm also a Senior Auditor and Consultant for ENAC, where I provide leadership in the development of new programs and industry white papers through my coordination of advisory committees of industry experts. I'm also a certified system auditor, CISA, and I'm certified in risk and information systems control. As an introduction to this, well, first our agenda is we'll have a brief introduction followed by the other panelists who will talk about cloud service providers, assumptions versus realities, security framework, creating a methodology for identifying risk, privacy and security, who is responsible for what, assessment, completing the risk assessment and identifying controls, and audit, value of third-party audits. At the end, we will have a question and answer session, and as Sam mentioned at the beginning, please feel free to submit questions along the way, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. So first, for an introduction, ENAC is the Electronic Healthcare Network Accreditation Commission, an independent 501c6 not-for-profit agency, and we work with, as a voluntary self-governing standards developed organization, in developing accreditation programs for organizations that electronically exchange healthcare data. So programs are developed for electronic healthcare networks, health information exchanges, accountable care organizations, management service organizations, third-party administrators, health information service providers, e-prescribing, etc. So we have a lot of different programs for the different types of organizations that work in the healthcare space of exchanging data. And with these programs, as you can imagine, and with the organizations that are reviewed and accredited, there is a stronger and stronger move toward cloud technology. Traditionally, organizations had, way back when they had their own data centers, more and more they have outsourced data centers, and now more and more organizations are looking at the value proposition of moving to cloud services. 83% of healthcare organizations are using cloud-based applications today, and the bulk of new IT spending this year is said to be geared toward cloud computing by Gartner. Nearly half of large enterprises are planning to have cloud deployments by the end of 2017. And of course, money talks, and that is when you look at the promises of cloud computing, including the rapid elasticity, being able to grow and shrink your services very rapidly, on-demand self-service, resource pooling, measured services. There are a lot of benefits of moving to the cloud, but there are a lot of risks, of course, associated with this as well. So as ENAC looked at being able to support cloud service providers, we looked primarily at taking a risk-based approach and requiring that the organizations going through ENAC accreditation that want to pursue cloud take a careful look at what the various risk factors are or threat vectors are as they look to deploy to cloud. So the identification of the appropriate controls needed to be, the controls needed to be identified. The responsibility for those controls need to be identified, at what point the controls fall under the candidate versus the cloud service provider, or where it's a shared responsibility. Proof of compliance with each control needs to be demonstrated. And for those controls under the CSP's responsibility, FedRAMP or SOC 2 audit proof could be presented and cross-mapped. So ENAC took the approach of, instead of the traditional route of needing to visit each of the data centers that are involved for accreditation, in the case of a cloud, we look to the strongest or one of the strongest third-party programs out there that review clouds, which is FedRAMP, which the federal government has looked to for certifying clouds, and we've adopted that, the requirement that if an organization is going to be using cloud at this point in time, we will accept it if they are using FedRAMP certified services within that cloud. And then we have a program built around those controls and the other controls ENAC has in a new program called CEAP, Cloud Enabled Accreditation Program. So that is how ENAC has gone about building support for it. And in putting together the Cloud Enabled Accreditation Program, we worked with a group of advisories, an advisory team of CSP experts. And I'm very happy to have 3 of those experts on the panel today, representatives from 3 of the organizations that helped ENAC in this process. Again, Scott Paddock with Amazon, Kurt Hagerman with Armor, and Scott Schimpf with Alpha 2. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kurt to talk about cloud service providers, assumptions versus realities. Kurt?
Thanks, Ron, and glad to be here and glad to have all of you on the phone. So really kind of talking about the winding road to security and compliance in the cloud, and we're talking about assumptions. So go ahead and go to the next slide for me, Ron. So security and compliance really is a journey. So achieving and maintaining a truly secure posture is an ongoing living process that involves more than just technology. You have to have governance and risk management, and then along with people and processes for technology, as well as technology. Too often folks rely too much on technology. They buy a lot of tools. The security space is full of tool vendors who will sell you their tool and oftentimes overstate or oversell what it can help you do, especially when it comes to compliance. And without the right people and processes in place to take advantage of that technology, you're still going to be left in a non-secure and a non-compliant manner. So, you know, it's very difficult to do this all right by yourself as an organization. And the other thing is that no single service provider has a complete solution. A lot of them may try to tell you that they can solve all your problems, but there's really no single vendor who's got the answers to everything that you need. And I've found oftentimes that vendors tend to oversimplify the requirements to sell their services more as a silver bullet. So this has been especially true in the payment card industry space, where there were a lot of specific and prescriptive requirements out there that gave rise to some new industries like log management industries. And what I've found is a lot of folks just kind of oversell. I mean, it's part of marketing, but you have to be a little careful with that. Next slide. So some of the challenges facing cloud consumers and providers alike is, you know, a lot of consumers want to outsource not only the technology, but they also want to outsource their security and compliance responsibilities. And it's really important to remember that you cannot completely offload any of your responsibilities. There are very few vendors that do 100% of security. There's no vendor that can do 100% of your compliance. So you have to understand that you still own the primary responsibility for your compliance, and that includes overseeing any vendors that you choose to outsource portions of that to. Find that providers may not adequately define the division of responsibilities between themselves and their customers. So when you're out searching, you read the marketing material, and when you try to get answers beyond the marketing material, it becomes more difficult because people are sometimes hesitant to get into the details. They also, providers often, and this is not all, but this is an observation that I've had, often don't clearly articulate what security they take on or how they help their customers meet compliance requirements. So they'll say, hey, we've got some security. So oftentimes they'll describe it a little bit, but when it comes time to understand, well, how does that actually help me meet my compliance burden? In other words, it's great that you have that, but can you help me understand how that takes something off of my plate when it comes to compliance? And all of these things lead to confusion in the purchasing decision and can create conflicts during audits. I know in a previous career I was a QSA, and I have too many to even remember stories of walking in to do an audit for a customer and having them put down one or two attestations of compliance from their providers and say, well, they're taking care of it all, so what do you need to talk to me about? And then having to go through that very painful conversation of saying, well, what does this actually say? What does this actually? There's a whole lot left for you to do. So, that's just something that you've got to bear in mind. Next slide. So when you're looking at this, I wanted to kind of take a step back and look at the NIST cloud model definitions. There's really 5 characteristics, and I'm not going to read them all. It's basically on demand. I think everybody understands cloud. I think what I really wanted to focus on is the 3 service models. There's software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. And the responsibilities for security and compliance vary in those 3 service models. I mean, those obviously can be deployed differently as well, but that's not really the point of this. So next slide. So, and I apologize for the busyness of the slide, but I was trying to get the point across here that your responsibilities and those of your cloud vendor are going to vary based upon the model offered. So when you look at the left, you've got infrastructure as a service. It's effectively just facilities, hardware, and an abstraction layer and some APIs. I'm oversimplifying it, but it's effectively you're renting compute resources. And then on that end of the spectrum, security and compliance is really primarily yours. There may be some services that an IaaS provider will offer that can assist you in securing your environment. There are some specialty providers in that space that actually do quite a bit from a security and compliance perspective. But generally, and in most of those situations, you have the majority and of the compliance and security burden resting with you. As you move up the stack through platform as a service, they're building some middleware on there. You still have probably the majority. You still probably have a majority of the controls, but there's going to be slightly more that the provider will take on because they're not providing you with some middleware or platform to actually build an application on. And then you go all the way up to the SaaS, the software as a service model. And really, that's where you're depending upon your vendor for a great deal of the security and compliance. I mean, you get to something like a Salesforce. It's basically an application that you use. You can do a lot of amazing things on Salesforce, but you have very little control, if any, over the actual infrastructure and the storage of the data and the protection of the data because it is essentially software as a service. So when you're looking at going to the cloud, you have to understand how your responsibility changes with the model that you're considering using. Next slide, please. And again, this just goes into a little more detail. I think I've already covered a lot of it. IaaS, infrastructure as a service, are like AWS, Azure, Rackspace, SoftLayer. They provide all the security for the underlying infrastructure. Many of them have a significant number of compliance attestations, but you have to understand that those really only apply to the underlying infrastructure, and they provide minimal leverage for the security and compliance requirements for the servers and applications that you manage, and that you again own nearly 100% of the compliance responsibility. And again, I gave some examples of additional services all the way up to the SaaS with more explanation. And I don't want to just read the slide. I think it's something you can review later. But again, just to recap, it's as the model changes, the responsibility between you and your provider will change, and the focus that you have changes, because if you're going to rely more on your vendor, you're going to have to do more due diligence to understand exactly what your vendor is doing for you. Next slide. So here's some common challenges that I've seen in this space. One of them is identifying the division of responsibility for security and compliance between you and your vendor. It's just a challenge. I mean, some vendors are very, very transparent. Others are less so. And even the ones that are transparent, you have to make sure that they're presenting the information in a format that you can understand and you can map to your requirements. Again, ensuring the services your vendor is providing are properly mapped to your risk assessment. This is especially true in healthcare. The whole foundation for HIPAA compliance is that you start with a risk assessment and identifying the threats and vulnerabilities that exist within your operations as they relate to the protection of PHI, and then you put controls in place to help mitigate those risks. So you need to make sure that the services that you're getting, you can clearly map to your own risk assessment so that you can show that the control you've decided to put in place to mitigate that risk is you've outsourced it to a third party who's providing that risk mitigation for you. Another common challenge is being able to obtain the evidence you need for your audit. So again, vendors will vary in their ability to, or their willingness to provide specific evidence. Again, not everybody. It's just one of those things that you have to be mindful of, and probably you want to talk about early on in the process to find out how cooperative they'll be and what kinds of requirements they may have on what kind of information they can provide or how you can use it or those kinds of things. Another challenge is getting objective attestation documentation from the vendor for the controls that they have full or some partial responsibility for. Again, it's all in the proof. They can say, and this is especially true in the past in PCI, is they could get an attestation of compliance saying, hey, we're PCI compliant. And there was no real documentation in that AOC that said exactly what they were, what that validation was for, what controls were included. And so a lot of companies would over-assume what those responsibilities were. So you need to have, make sure that you've got detailed enough documentation about that they've been third-party audited and that you can be assured that those services are provided in a secure manner. Monitoring ongoing compliance of your vendors. A lot of people say they do a lot of very good vendor due diligence up front, and then they sign up, and that's all. So you have to make sure that you have an annual program to make sure that you're monitoring the compliance posture of your vendors. Make sure that you're requesting those updates to those reports as they're available. And if new things come about, new requirements come about, you're asking them about, are they including those? How are they dealing with that kind of stuff? And then also is receiving support from your vendor during a breach event. So you need to talk about that kind of stuff up front. What is their incident response plan? How do you participate in that? How can you participate? How can they participate in your incident response plan? You need to understand, because if it's a shared model like that, they're providing some, you're providing some, you have to have those details at least worked out in a framework, because otherwise you'll be ill-prepared for any sort of a breach event. Next slide. So I think I've covered most of these things. This is really the last slide of my presentation. It's a to-do list. You need to, first of all, a consumer needs to understand all of their security and compliance responsibilities. They need to be able to effectively evaluate and understand the different cloud provider models. Ask for clear definition. They have to have good vendor management programs. So again, we've talked about the things that consumers have to do. Providers, they have to be a little more. They have to be willing to be and work to be more transparent about their security programs and deliver adequate details about their offered services. And they have to be able to clearly articulate the delineation of responsibilities between themselves and their customers. And also, be clear about how their offered services can assist consumers in meeting their client or compliance requirements. I'm not suggesting that none of the vendors do any of this. I'm just suggesting these are the things that you need to have in your, in your repertoire of questions. These are just the things you need to work out. And oftentimes, following up on these kinds of questions will help you make that first cut of vendors, because those who answer these easily, have quick answers, can quickly and clearly provide you with this kind of information, are probably the ones that you're going to want to investigate further. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Ron.
Thank you, Kurt. And just real quick housekeeping. We're running a little bit long, and I do want to make sure our presenters provide their full presentations, because I think that's really what's going to provide the most value to the audience. So if we run a little short on Q&A at the end, we will follow up with as many of those as we can following the webinar. So please do feel free to submit questions, and if we can't get to all of them at the end of this, we'll follow up via email. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Scott Paddock, who's going to talk about security framework, creating a methodology for identifying risk, and privacy and security. Who is responsible for what? Scott?
Great, thank you, Ron. The slide you'll want to step through. Perfect, thank you. So the question maybe should be at this point, why bother? What's so great about a risk and governance framework? Other than, the obvious answer, which is you're obliged to have one if you're aiming to be HIPAA compliant. There are other benefits, and I'd like to call those out. It helps you to identify and address the most significant issues first. If you didn't do a risk assessment, you might not know which of the threats or the factors would be of the greatest concern. You wouldn't have a ranking or the ability to rank them without having first sort of teased them apart a little bit. Next one, please. Promotes the efficient allocation of resources and efforts. So now that you know which ones are the most problematic or the most dangerous or the most alarming, you can assign resources to those based in a more graded manner, so that you're putting your dollars in the position where it can do the greatest reward for you. So there's a little bit of an ROI factor there. Next, please. It also helps in the area of organizational maturity and audit readiness. If you are, going to be facing audits in any kind of a regular rhythm, you will want to be able to have the controls demonstrated, the material evidence ready to go, and then, marrying that back to the risk assessment at the outset to show that you are on top of your overall security posture. And sometimes I intertwine these by saying security and compliance, and it seems like, at least in the context of this model, they both fit pretty well. So I could say that this is a security concern, I could say that this is a compliance concern, and be truthful in both cases. Last one. And the good news is you don't have to invent this from scratch. There are some great choices already around that you can capitalize on. And those are on the next slide. So these are maybe the big ones. COBIT is an ISACA framework. That ISACA is an organization that basically governs risk and compliance controls. I know that they have changed their name such they used to be, like an acronym, and now it doesn't stand for anything in particular. It's formerly Information Systems Audit and Control. Now it's just ISACA. Doesn't make any difference. It's a good compliance framework. ISO has the ISO 27001 you probably have run across. That is a risk-oriented compliance framework. ITIL is very popular in Europe. It is a little bit different approach, but the same basic material is contained within. And then maybe the one that's becoming most popular, at least in the US, is NIST, principally because it's free. If you want the ISO standards or COBIT or ITIL, you're opening the purse strings, whereas NIST being a government-funded thing, you can pick this up for free. And there are, depending upon the NIST document specifically, is called SP 800-53, and it is a big audit standard, and there are, give or take, 300 controls that may or may not all apply depending on whether you are aiming for a low, a moderate, or a high standard. The high standard, incidentally, is due out, last I looked, this next coming month. That will define what the controls are for the FedRAMP and FISMA the high standard. So we're waiting for that to be delivered. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So what can those do for you? Well, if you have a governance framework and a risk model in place, it makes certification efforts across the board far less painful. Now, admittedly, in this lineup, I have HIPAA, which is not, until Health and Human Services makes an audit standard, something that you could be certified for. But the rest of these may have meaning for you, and these are all the kinds of things that are promoted and made possible by having a governance framework in place. And at the bottom there, you can see I have a call out. ANAC has accepted the FedRAMP, which relies on the NIST standard I mentioned a moment ago, as a good control framework for their purposes. So if you are using a service provider who, as an example, is FedRAMP, the approval for FedRAMP is called an authorization to operate, or an ATO. And if you're dealing with an organization that has an ATO, that should make much of the remaining compliance landscape a lot easier for you to build upon. If you could go to the next slide for me, please, Ron. So those of you who are familiar with Amazon may recognize that I have tried to de-identify this a little bit. The spirit of this graphic is to call out, in much the same way that Kurt was doing earlier, the mechanism or the model by which we are trying to make clear that there is a shared responsibility. And this is another that makes sense both in a security context as well as in a compliance context. And at the bottom there in orange, your cloud service provider, whether it's AWS or somebody else, is going to cover this kind of territory. So from the pouring of the foundations to the ping power and pipe and the controls, the guns and the guards and all that kind of happy jazz up to a point. And maybe that point for you is, as a customer, you'll say, okay, I can log in and give them my credit card, and then within a few minutes I've got a virtual cloud server up and running. And that's great, and a lot of folks do it. Now let's further carry the thought along. Might you install antivirus or anti-malware, or put a firewall in place, or do system service packs and patches and updates? And these are all things that a provider would not necessarily do for you. You may find that there are also managed service providers who will try to fill that gap, but generally this is going to be something that will remain on the customer side of the responsibility model, that little dotted line there. It varies a little bit with services and providers, but the spirit of this is really the distinctive part. And to lift directly from the Amazon marketing, it's the difference between the security of the cloud and the security in the cloud. So a service provider can do their level best to make the environment secure for your use, and you can walk into there and without any controls in place probably create a problem of access control or of availability or of updating by way of omission or accident that would affect your security and compliance posture. So this is maybe the takeaway shot from my section, that this is the model that we're trying to convey. And this is going to be truthful, you know, for when you're going forward and doing auditing for HIPAA, as well as just basic day-to-day, who's responsible for this kind of thing. My authentication, my identity controls, these sort of matters are something that get designed in this infrastructure in such a way that it's meant to be very clear who has responsibility for what. And that may be the key to this whole point, is to say, whether it's for ANAC or your, you know, whatever compliance you might be facing with, it's going to be a matter of clearly defining who's responsible for what, and the service provider in question should be very open and inviting of you to explain their answers. If you could go to the next slide, please. So these are going to need stepping through too. This is a quick little Q&A gut check kind of a thing. So the question is, if I sign on with a cloud provider that is certified or compliant with HIPAA or PCI or fill in the blank, am I then certified or compliant also? And the answer is no, you are not, because the scope of influence for these are invariably going to be larger than just your service provider. So, you know, for the sake of HIPAA people, I know that there's a lot of HIPAA know-how on the call. For the purposes of the security and the privacy rule, that is merely a subset of Title II. There are so many other titles and aspects to HIPAA that would not be in any way influenced by your service provider. For example, which ICD codes might you be using? Who knows? It is not something that the service provider will have any insight upon. So there are factors that still remain. Next question, how do I tell if a cloud provider is certified or compliant with a given standard or regulation? You should be able to ask for evidence to that, to be able to say, okay, show me your ISO, show me your FedRAMP, show me your NIST, whatever it is you've got that you can show me that you have the controls, that some third-party attestation organization has reviewed them, and that you are sharing the successful results with me so that I can leverage them as a customer. And the last one is compliance something that is regional or service-based. This gets a little tricky sometimes. The scope is invariably going to be called out in the documentation that you receive, so you should be able to pretty easily understand, does this apply to multiple regions? Does this apply to multiple services? Do I have any other limits on account types or involvement of additional people? The only one that I can think of that kind of really draws a pretty heavy-handed line is the compliance for ITAR, which is the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation, that specifies that everyone who supports those accounts must be a U.S. person, which, I guess I can see where they're coming from. That's the only one that I'm aware of that has that qualifier. The rest really shouldn't be a big deal unless there is a data sovereignty factor or some other kind of geologic or geographic consideration. That, I believe, is my last slide. So, Ron, is it back to you?
It is. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that very much. Our last panelist, Scott Schimpf with Alpha 2, will talk about assessment, completing the risk assessment, and identifying controls, and audit, value of third-party audits. Scott?
Thank you, Ron. I just wanted to give everybody a quick introduction. I come at this from a little bit different angle than the first two presenters. We are actually a software as a service provider, so I utilize the cloud for our services. And we have been doing that for about 4 years now, and have gone through a lot of these processes that they've been talking about, trying to vet various cloud providers. And in that last 4 years, we've actually been able to get 2 ENAC accreditations. One is for HNAP, which is for clearinghouses, and the other is for DRAP, which is for registries, and we are a PQRS registry. So just kind of give you an idea where I'm coming from at this. I'm not a Amazon-type cloud provider. We are actually in the healthcare industry. So next slide, please. The topics we're talking about today, assessment, completing that risk assessment and identifying controls and the value of that third-party audit. That risk assessment is so important to every piece that we're talking about here. I can't emphasize enough how important that is to be in place to help you secure your environment. Next slide, please. Completing that risk assessment is a daunting task. We went through it several years ago. When you first look at it, you'll say to yourself, there's no way that we can get through this. Some things that help is talk to other companies that have gone through this exercise. We have taken advantage of being at WEDI and being able to talk to people who had recently gone through this and trying to get their ideas on how they were able to tackle this. That's a very important part. Another thing is third-party consultants. Having somebody come in that has helped other companies through this process, come in and work with you and try to get you on the right track. One thing that helped us get through the process was look at that risk assessment plan and take it in bite-sized chunks. We basically broke it out into multiple sessions, a couple a week, and yes, it did take a long time at that pace, but it allows you to not feel overwhelmed and take it in small chunks to go through and really dig into and make sure that you're doing the right risk assessment for each one of those. One thing that I think was very instrumental in us getting a very good risk assessment in our company was involving team members from each department. As IT and the folks that I have, we have ideas of where things are considered secure or not, but bringing in people from development and talking to them about how our software works and even the accounting people and what we have risks on that side, that was very helpful in just getting done. And the biggest thing, I think, to really help you make this a smooth process is upper management involvement. They have to have buy-in. You have to be able to get those resources to help you through this assessment process. Next slide, please. One of the things that you have to tell yourself is you have to be honest with your assessment. This is a tool to help you mitigate risk. This does not say that you haven't been doing your job the last couple of years. This is just a tool that everybody needs to go through to say, where am I at right now? Every company out there has room to improve. We've gone through this, and every year we do a reassessment of this process here and look where we are, what have we changed, and what other new things have come up. So I think they've talked about this in previous slides here. It is really a living document or a living process that you go through for security. You can't go through it one time and say, hey, I'm good on this, we'll just move on. You have to keep looking at it. And one of the things that we did through this is actually come up with some controls on our side. And here's just two examples of it. We went through an audit one night and went through and looked under keyboards and in desk drawers and all around the company and found passwords all over the place. We implemented a web-based password repository that we've required everybody to use, and everybody has access to it and can set up their own permissions and keep passwords out there, because everybody has websites they log in, other things that they could put out there that somebody could find off their desk. So we implemented that and have since done those audits, and they're not finding passwords anymore. So that's something that was brought to our attention through our risk assessment that we've had to try to go out and mitigate. Another step was we implement the cloud when we were looking at some of the protections we have of our site from the internet, and we implemented an intrusion detection / protection system out there, an IDS or IPS, to try to see when people are hacking us, to be proactive in that process instead of finding out later that you've had somebody try to hack you for the last several days. These type of things are actually very instrumental in trying to protect your business. Next slide, please. The value of that third-party audit. You don't know what you don't know, and I cannot emphasize that enough, that when you're looking at your risk assessment, when you're looking at this whole process, there are a lot of pieces out there that even I have not covered, or the other gentleman on this may not have covered. Getting multiple people involved and having them help you is very important. It helps you ask the right questions of your cloud provider, and I think this was covered in a lot of the slides before this, but a few specific things for me is, where's my data stored? Does it ever move overseas? Do I have regulations on my particular industry that would not allow that? Who else has access to that hardware? How do they vet their people that are actually getting in there and accessing that hardware? And they talked about this in more detail than I will, but what certifications and accreditations do they have, and what do they mean for you? And I think that was a very important slide that was covered in the previous presentation, is just because they have that, it doesn't mean that you have that. It just means that they've gone through that process themselves. Last one on there is shared infrastructure, non-shared infrastructure. Again, what are your regulations and everything else you need to be compliant at? And then you need to say which side of that coin do you need to be on to protect your information. And this is all about protecting that information and your company. Next slide, please. Security. They always talk about the 3 most important things that you're looking at, and that's something that I just cannot stress more. When you go to a cloud provider and you're getting your things set up in their cloud, you're the one that's going to be responsible for the security of that data. Things like firewalls and intrusion protection and site-to-site communication are extremely important. Security scans. Even though you're in the cloud, you should still go through and do internal scans and then have a third party do it at least annually to see where your vulnerabilities are, because that changes. Everybody's coming up out there every day with new ways to try to hack systems, and you want to get that information and see how you can protect yourself. When you talk about, the audits, like Ron said, if you're a FedRAMP, they're not going to want to do it on-site, but if you're not FedRAMP, they're going to go see that facility. And that goes into that physical security of that building. What's it like? We have to look at their controls and everything else to be able to protect that data. It all comes down to the very last line there, threat recognition and mitigation. You go through the process, you get a third-party auditor to go through and look at it, you do your risk assessment, and you find those areas that are threats, and you do what you can to mitigate them. And every year you kind of go through that process, and you'll find that year to year you'll get more and more secure and be more comfortable what you've actually been able to implement for security. Next slide. And I think at this point we're going to try to end it right here and see if we can jump out into questions. I know we don't have a whole lot of time yet, but I'll turn this back over to Ron.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Appreciate that very much. We do have some time here, about 15 minutes, for any questions and answers. So I believe Mark Cohn is going to help us with this. So Mark, have we received any questions?
Yep, we have. So we've got one. Are both the FedRAMP and SOC 2 audits required from the CSP to substitute for a site visit?
Okay, and I guess that is probably directed specifically at ENAC, so I can speak to that. From an ENAC perspective, if you're going after an ENAC accreditation, if you are using a cloud service provider, ENAC requires that it be a cloud service provider that has been through FedRAMP certification. As Scott Paddock, I believe, mentioned, they've got to have the authority to operate through ATO through FedRAMP, and the services that you have deployed in that cloud need to be within that FedRAMP certification. So that is the requirement. We do not require the SOC 2. That was mentioned in terms of a third-party audit that you could use if you've been through that to map the findings of that audit to ENAC's requirements.
All right. Anybody else want to chime in there? Okay, not hearing anything. Next question. So what documentation should I ask for from a cloud vendor as part of my risk assessment? Should we be asking for something on their risk program, their contingency planning, their policies and procedures? So it sounds like I'm trying to get a little bit more clarification on potentially what that vendor could or should be providing.
Sure. Could you respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it starts with the third-party attestation reports. Oftentimes, vendors are not going to provide their internal documentation because it could provide a roadmap, but those external certifications gives you the evidence that you need to know that those policies and procedures exist. But I think more importantly would be to ask for specific detailed descriptions of the services and how those services can be leveraged by the purchaser to assist in their own risk mitigation as well. So how do those services map into the risks, their risk assessment, as well as how those services can help them address their compliance requirements. In other words, like a matrix saying, here's all the services and help me by showing me how those services address specific whether that be HIPAA or PCI or anything else, requirements, would be some good information to grab.
Thank you, Kurt.
This is Scott
Go ahead,
Paddock.
Scott.
I'll just add one little tidbit. If the end result is meant to be HIPAA compliance, one of the things that might be helpful is if you can find something that supports the cloud service provider's compliance with the NIST framework that I mentioned, the SP 800-53, because that happily enough contains all the controls that you'll need for the security and privacy rule compliance, and there's a document that NIST has that maps them for you to save you a little bit of legwork. The document is SP 800-66.
Thank you, Scott. Next question, Mark.
Yeah, I think there's one that follows up on that. Should I expect my cloud vendor to sign a business associate agreement?
All right. I'll ask Scott Schimpf to comment on that.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the things that we required of our cloud vendor, is to sign a BAA agreement. When you look at that in the coverage of how you're basically going into business together and are both in various levels responsible for the protection of that data, then yes, you would have to have them sign that. We've had to put several of those in place with various vendors along the way, and then it's really to make sure that you're protected and you're doing everything you can to protect that data, so yes.
And this is Kurt. I'd just like to add that as a vendor, you really don't have a choice. With the change in the HIPAA laws regarding business associates and the expansion of the definition in the omnibus rule, you know, as a vendor, if you're providing any sort of services that, you know, for PHI, for the storage or protection of PHI, you don't have a choice. You have to sign. Now, you can still negotiate them, but you know, that should be an expectation.
Thanks, Chris, for that clarification. I was going to jump in with that because from a high-tech standpoint, you really don't. It was clarified that those vendors are holding your PHI and you need that agreement. Let's see. The next question is there a current listing system of cloud vendors that have external certification with these programs, similar to the CHPL, the Certified Health IT Product List?
This is Kurt. I'm not aware of any sort of comprehensive listing, mostly because I think the only ones that exist are PCI does have the Visa and MasterCard each maintain lists of validated service providers, but when you get to the like SOC reports or ISO certs, those are all done by independent auditors, so there is no global registry that I'm aware of. Scott, you might know differently, but
the only one that comes to mind is the FedRAMP has a register or a list where you can look up an organization's authorizations to operate.
Yeah, that's the other one. Yep, you're right about that. Those are the only ones, though.
Okay. Last question that I'm seeing here. What's the most significant threat vectors when deploying to the cloud?
That can probably be kind of a loaded question, but
I was just going to wait to see who jumped in on that one.
This is Kurt. I'll say application security. So making sure that your applications are securely coded and securely deployed. That's the most common vector. And I would say the other one is authentication, is having a strong authentication mechanism to be able to allow and be able to, you know, control who has access to those applications.
Yeah, and I'd like to actually throw in security patching. If you are putting out servers out there that are actually exposed to the outside world, keeping up with those security patches and making sure that you apply those in a timely manner is very important as well, because the longer you leave that open, the more possibility you have of being hacked.
That's all the questions that I'm seeing come through, Ron.
Okay. I might ask a couple more since we have a few more minutes here. And let's see. One question that was submitted, how do I get started on a risk assessment? First of all, Scott Schimpf, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, there's plenty of resources out on the web to actually get started on a risk assessment. You can go out there and download templates, try to traverse that. I still think that having a third-party vendor step in and help you with that is worthwhile. I know that a lot of people look at that cost in there, but risk assessments are vital to actually making sure that your enterprise is secure. So having somebody come in there and help you get started and know where to look is very important. I think we actually, again, as I talked about in my slides, took the approach that it is a company-wide process, and getting more people involved and everybody else to help you give feedback will also help you get through that process and get started as well.
Great.
I've got another, and I've got another question that came in also.
Okay. I was just going to say, and as was mentioned earlier, NIST has some excellent resources regarding putting together a risk assessment, and there are others out there as well. In terms of putting it together, Kurt or Scott Paddock, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on best approaches to begin with a risk assessment.
I think downloading some templates is great, and there's a lot of good starting points. But I think what you have to have is an awareness of really understanding how you are interacting with whatever the data is that is subject to the risk assessment. So call it sensitive data. But really being able to, before you can even begin the risk assessment, you have to understand the process flow. So how do you interact with that data? How do you get it? How do you obtain that data? What processes internally act on that data? And if you end up sharing that data, how do you share that data with either with other departments within your organization or with external organizations? You really have to have a good, solid understanding of how all of that works and what systems and processes, and it's not just about technology, it's about people processes as well, touch the data. And so if you don't have a good map for how that data flows through your organization, it's going to be very difficult then to look at, well, what are the threats and risks to how I handle it? So I think getting that down and then using that in combination with one of these templates will make it a lot easier.
Thank you. And I think it's so important, exactly what you're saying, and that is you've got to really take the responsibility on, not think that a tool is going to solve this. I've got my tool called risk assessment and I've checked all the boxes or whatever. You've got to own it. You've got to understand exactly the things you mentioned, Kurt. Excellent point. Okay, Mark.
So the next question here, if the cloud services are purchased through a third-party reseller, is the business associate between the third-party reseller or the cloud provider?
This is Scott Paddock. I'll weigh in on this one because I see it pretty regularly. And I don't know that this is true broadly, but at least in the context of what AWS says, the BAA is a contract addendum between whomever has the contract, the agreement with us, the customer agreement or enterprise agreement or whatever it is. It's an addendum to that. So if there's a service provider in the mix, from the Amazon perspective, that's the account owner and holder. So we would be expecting to have a BAA with them. Now, if it turns out that there's a change of ownership down the road, that's something that can be accommodated. But the simple answer is it's a direct relationship and an extension on an existing agreement.
So in your case, Scott, just to maybe clarify that for everyone, you would have a business associate agreement with, I'll say, the reseller. That would be the contract between you two. The individual purchasing from the reseller would have a contract between the reseller and the purchaser because you basically, from an AWS standpoint, would be considered a subcontractor.
Yeah, there for sure is an end-to-end quality, and I guess I would also characterize that it's not so much reseller where I see this, it's service provider. An organization might say, you know, we really want to be in cloud services, but we don't feel like we have the chops in-house, so we're going to hire this third party to help us make the migration to whatever cloud platform we like. That's more the scenario that I see, and then that would be the case where we would be amending or having an addendum to that agreement, which in the fullness of time may be transferred to the end customer, in this case the service providers or managed service providers customer.
So Ron, it looks like we're just right at that cutoff point, and I don't have anything else coming in.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you handling the questions. And again, I'd like to thank each of the panelists. I think this was an excellent webinar. Hopefully it provided very helpful information for those who are pursuing cloud. And we will, Mark, maybe you can just talk quickly about the provision of these slides and also the WEDI conference.
Yeah, certainly. So if you're looking for the handouts themselves, as Sam pointed out, you know, you can look right there on the GoToMyMeeting and download the slides. But something that Ron failed to mention up front is he's also the co-chair of the sub-work group for cloud computing under the privacy and security work group from WEDI. And I would encourage anyone in the audience that is listening to the call that if you're interested in that work group, that sub-work group, or the work group for privacy and security from a WEDI standpoint, we will have the WEDI conference that is coming up on the 25th, I believe, which is Tuesday night. We have a reception at the conference itself, and the privacy and security co-chairs will be there at a table. So we would encourage you to stop by, leave us your name, let us know what you're interested in, because we can always use some volunteer help in order to get issue briefs, white papers, any kind of deliverables out from an implementation standpoint for the healthcare community.
Thank you, Mark. And with that, I'll close off the webinar. Again, I appreciate everyone's attendance, and thanks again for our panelists. Have a great day.
Thanks.